take. I'm very happy to be introducing Michael Denning today, whose article in the May-June New Left Review, Everyone a Legislator, is what has been a source of a lot of thought that I go through each time I have time to read a few pages. There will be, I don't know, I always think of, what I loved about Michael's article is he brings up Joe Hill right in the middle of it. And I don't know if Michael's aware, but we have this thing at the Marxist Education Project called Bookmarks. But the back is a quote from Gramsci in L'Ordine Nuovo on educate yourselves because we need your intelligence, rouse yourselves, we need your enthusiasm, organize because we need all your strength. But that was in 1919, and Michael will explain how much more Gramsci developed that and where we can develop our ideas from this work now that we're in the 21st century. I'm not going beyond this. I'm giving the Zoom floor over to Michael, and welcome everyone, and welcome to you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, and hello everyone. This piece was the third in a series of essays that I've written on Gramsci for Gramsci conferences, one in Michigan, one in North Carolina, and this one in Vancouver. One was on Gramsci's theory of labor, another on the U.S. reception of Gramsci, and this one more or less on Gramsci's political thought. And I'm not going to read the essay since it's already appeared in print. So what I want to do today, just to kick off the conversation, is make two remarks about why Gramsci, why I wrote these essays, and then briefly outline the four arguments of Everyone a Legislator for those who haven't had a chance to read it. For those who have read it, feel free to ask specific questions, raise specific objections, or things like that. So I was trying to, 2021 is 50 years since the appearance of selections from the prison notebooks in English back in 1971. It's kind of 50 years of Gramscian English. It didn't get a lot. I was trying to track down whether it was actually reviewed by many people. Not that many, but one particularly well-known and important one, Eric Hobsbawm, reviewed it in the New York Review of Books in 1974. It took 3 years before it was reviewed under the title The Great Gramsci. So that's one moment, 1971, I want to highlight. The other one is it's 130 years since Gramsci's birth in 1891. And for those of you who, if you don't know anything about Gramsci, I'll just do the quick biography. Gramsci was essentially a scholarship student who'd gone from rural Sardinia to the University of Turin around 1910, was a young militant in the Socialist Party of the 1910s, that early 20th century emergence of socialist and workers' parties around the world, was part of the post-World War I revolutionary upheavals that ranged from the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 to the May 4th movement in China in 1919. In Italy, it was marked by the factory strikes and occupations of 1919 to 1920, which Gramsci, still in his mid-20s, was active in and which really shaped him. A couple years later, he was a founder of the Italian Communist Party, which had split off from the Italian Socialist Party. He spent time in the Soviet Union in the early 1920s as a representative to the Comintern of the Italian Party. He was elected to the Italian Parliament as a communist deputy in the mid-part of the 1920s, and then, of course, was arrested and imprisoned in 1926 under Mussolini, and spent a decade in prison after that, dying in 1937. If one was looking at the United States, one might not just Joe Hill, but one might note Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl of the IWW struggles of the 19 teens, who was born a year year earlier in 1890. John Reed is a little older than Gramsci, 4 years older. Dorothy Day and Paul Robeson are a little younger than Gramsci. His exact contemporary in the U.S. was another Italian who migrated to the U.S., the young anarchist Niccolò Sacco, who, along with Bartolomeo Svenzetti, was executed in the U.S. in 1927, at the same time that Gramsci was in Mussolini's prisons. I've always thought it odd and that no American has actually written a piece that would think about Gramsci and Sacco and Vanzetti together. I think that would actually open up both Gramsci scholarship and Sacco and Vanzetti scholarship. And Gramsci's had a paradoxical place in the U.S. after much attention among the New Left in the 1970s after the publication of the translation. I think his work has been eclipsed on the left despite an unprecedented amount of scholarly attention. I think it's interesting that the original Selections was published by a left-wing press, International, whereas the scholarly translations of Gramsci have been published by a university press, Columbia Press. And as I said, one of my essays is called Why No Gramsci in the United States? And I'd be happy later to talk further about Gramsci's reception and legacy and the peculiarities of Gramsci in the U.S. But this particular essay grew out of a seminar that I taught with Luca Peretti, who is an Italian scholar of film and 20th century Italian culture. It was great fun teaching Gramsci with someone who could read him in the original easily and all of that. And I had always been most influenced by Gramsci's writings on culture and had probably taught those for the most part, but that was also Luca's strength. So the seminar led me to engage more systematically with Gramsci's political thought. And I came to think, as some of us do if we start reading this, that it was misunderstood. That the emphasis on Gramsci as a Marxist theorist of the state and the party was misleading. And so this essay really came out of that course, and then the invitation to talk about this at one of the Gramsci conferences. And there's really 4 arguments in it. Which I'll do very briefly, but I'm just sort of lay these out, and then I'm very happy to go in any direction people would like. The first argument, and perhaps the most kind of internal one, is that Gramsci was really engaged not in political science, but in the critique of political science. And here on a model not unlike thinking about Marx, and Gramsci was self-conscious about this, that Marx was not working in classical economics, but was developing the critique of political economy, and often began with some of the concepts of political economy, but in order to undermine them, to critique them, and revise them. And so similarly, I think Gramsci, emerging at a time when modern political science was actually being invented, in part by leading Italian thinkers, was actually involved less in coming up with a new theory of the state or a new theory of politics or a new theory of a party, but engaging a critique of that. That the basis of this critique, and this is the second argument of the piece, is that the 2 halves of Gramsci's project, which I talk about in the essay, I could talk about whatever, which was, at one point he says in the prison notebooks that this book that he never wrote would have 2 halves to it. One, the analysis of the conditions for the national popular collective awakening, a kind of emergence of a social movement, and the other would be an analysis of a moral and cultural reformation. And that those 2 halves kind of shape much of how one might think about Gramsci's work. I always had paid more attention to the second half, that moral and cultural reformation, which was built around, in Gramsci's sense, an idea that everyone was an intellectual. that even though not all of us had the social function of being intellectuals, one had to begin by rejecting the idea that intellectual activity and cultural activity was some autonomous sphere separated from ordinary life, and indeed try to think about the ways in which everyone was an intellectual. And I became persuaded that a very strange phrase that Gramsci uses a number of times, that everyone is a legislator, was actually a kind of analogous move to actually to critique the sense that politics was a kind of autonomous region. Though, as he says, not everyone has the social function of being a legislator, and he clearly talks about people who are legislators in the public, and both elected ones and ones who are civil servants or whatever working for the state. The general sense is that everyone has a kind of legislative practice in their own life, insofar as they develop norms of conduct. And that the term norms of conduct was a kind of analogous to another equally important concept in Gramsci of conceptions of the world. That everyone is an intellectual because everyone has a conception of a world, is involved in passing on those conceptions, in struggling over those conceptions. That similarly, everyone is a legislator insofar as they pass on norms of conduct. And indeed, in some case, even as we follow norms of conduct, we become legislators. For those of us who are teachers in one way or another, the building of a syllabus or the holding of an examination is precisely these kinds of almost taken for granted norms of conduct that we legislate for our students in that kind of, in a school, by setting up, this is what you should read, these are the things that you should be responsible for an examination. Gramsci uses the example of the family and the way parents are legislators for their children, and he makes a clear thing that different people have different powers of legislation, different realms of legislation, but it's a very different way, I think, of understanding how political activity is taken. And indeed, I would suggest at one point, and this one I'm stretching Gramsci, he never does use the phrase organic legislator, but I do think that actually one could imagine a kind of organic legislator, not unlike the way he talks about an organic intellectual. And the organic, this is the third of the four arguments, the organic in Gramsci's organic intellectual, and I think in a notion of an organic legislator, is not organic as it's often taken in the U.S. in the roots connotation, someone who grows out of a certain place, but organic in the sense of an organizer. That Gramsci is a theorist throughout the prison notebooks of organizing, of organizers, of organization. And indeed, and this is the third of the four arguments, that rather than thinking of Gramsci as fundamentally a theorist of the party, one should think that the party was one historical form of organization, which Gramsci is very interested in, no question about that, but his larger legacy is actually thinking about political organization generally, and organizers generally. And indeed, I think one of the reasons this has not necessarily been seen is because the very concept of organizing that we, I think, take for granted, to the point, as I say, toward the end of this, that I think most young activists I've met think of themselves as organizers, not as partisans, not as members of a party. People don't have, which if you think of Partisan Review from the 1930s, there was a moment when being a partisan was something to be. But I think in some ways that has lost its kind of meaning in political rhetoric in some ways, so that people from AOC to Obama characterize themselves as organizers, even before party members in that kind of way. And that the notion of an organizer, if you go back to the OED, it fascinatingly emerges in English In the United States, the Knights of Labor is one of the first organizations that hires organizers to go out and do that work. That by the 1920s, there is a remarkable new attempt to theorize organizing. So that one of the first, I think it's volume 1 in the Little Lenin Library, published in the 1920s after Lenin's death, is called Lenin on Organization. And even though Lenin never wrote a book on organization, it sort of collects his variety of thoughts about organizing to put that together. 2 years later, the Communist Party has a magazine that they start called Party Organizer. But it's not just in the communist tradition. One finds in the social democratic tradition figure J.B.S. Hardman, who is the kind of education director for the clothing workers, is one of the people who thinks we have to start teaching organizing. And the Brookwood Labor College, which is one of the first places to train labor organizers, comes out of that moment. And I think the whole line that will eventually look quite normal to us of kind of community organizing, the work of Saul Alinsky, those kinds of things, actually marks a kind of that one could put Gramsci in that line of a new way of thinking about organizing. And we could say more about that. And then the fourth argument is that in thinking about this, Gramsci also develops a kind of analysis and critique of what he calls political fetishism. And I think this has been missed by American readers of Gramsci, partly because the notes that he talks about this have not been translated into English yet. There's still a lot of notes that remain only in Italian. And that notion works in two different kinds of ways for Gramsci. One, he has this idea that that political fetishism is that moment when we think, we, even as, and he says, members of a party or members of a trade union, think the organizations work by themselves without us being responsible for them. That in some way products of our own political labors take on a life of their own and seem to be autonomous causes of that. And he sees that as a real danger in the bureaucratization of organizations and things like that. And he has some interesting, only, as in often the case with Gramsci, these are only very sketchy little notes, but I think he's clearly thinking about that issue of what happens when a political organization becomes a kind of fetish. Again, on the model of Marx's commodity fetishism, but a very different sort of way of thinking about it. And the other argument then is his critique throughout his work that we do not fetishize the particular forms of political organization. That throughout Gramsci, one of his legacies to political thought, seems to me, is the sense that the forms of political organization are historical. That they come out of certain specific situations, that they respond to those, and that we remain fixed in them at our peril. He talks about the limits and strengths of trade unions. He talks about the limits and strengths of political parties. There's a wonderful passage where he says, anyone who thinks that the socialist society of the future should work like the Socialist Party is crazy. That the Socialist Party is built in order to compete within a certain kind of parliamentary political regime or whatever, and that it has all sorts of limits because of that. The trade union has limits because its purpose is to get a better deal in the selling of labor power. It's a very important thing in that, and Gramsci is but nonetheless there are limits of that. He has a fascinating account of the strengths of the conditions of Marx's own knowledge of it. He says Marx really only knew political organizations which were small secret conspiracies, journalistic groups, craft trade union groups. He has a variety of ones, and that Marx's idea of political possibility was in part shaped by those things. It seems to me as well that Gramsci's own notion of political things was shaped by the world that he knew. A certain kind of Fordist factory council that he saw in the occupations, a certain kind of parliamentary socialist party that he was part of, a certain kind of really embryonic communist party that he's part of in there, and particularly certain kinds of socialist cultural and educational institutions and newspapers like L'Ordine Novo. But that once again, we shouldn't think that Gramsci is the theorist of those situations because they are the kinds of organizations we had, but actually he's the theorist of how one might have a longer historical approach toward political organizations. So those are, where does that put me in time? Excellent, 2:26, just about how long I thought I would talk for, and I'm happy to take questions, objections, clarifications, thoughts, whatever.
I guess, hi, I'm Susan Comfort. I really enjoyed your article, though it's been about a couple months since I've read it, and I liked your talk. I guess the question that comes to mind immediately for me is, what are the implications of these insights about Gramsci and historicizing organization for the left now? In terms of the kinds of organizations that you see on the ground that are, what kind of limitations and what kind of strengths do you see? And I mean, is that the next step of your analysis?
I'm not sure that it is exactly. I guess perhaps it's because I started many years ago my career thinking I was going to be an organizer, ended up feeling like I was not a particularly effective organizer or whatever, and that I was a better teacher than organizer. And so I guess I've often had a kind of something of a some sort of modesty about prescribing political strategies to people who are doing the organizing, and more trying to imagine how one thinks through the political and intellectual legacies that we have from history in ways that could open up figures who might otherwise seem no longer relevant as ways that are relevant. And so I guess that's kind of the first interest in this. It does seem to me that much of the now scholarly debate, and maybe that would be a way to say, the thing that I start at the beginning is the question, does Gramsci have any legacy for contemporary politics? And that was the question that was put to us at this conference a couple of years back. And part of me began by saying no, that it did seem to me that in some sense Gramsci's fundamental legacy for the middle of the 20th century was in the reformation of communist parties, and that there were powerful communist parties, particularly in Europe and in Latin America, where Gramsci's ideas really allowed a different reformation inside those parties, and those parties now seem not particularly strong or vital in many ways. The other part, which is the one that I must say I grew up in, was a kind of cultural politics coming out of the New Left, which reimagined culture as simply a cultural politics, that long march through the institutions of the education system, of politics. It's always seemed to me intriguing that 1971 edition of Selection of Prison Notebooks begins, its first two sections are the sections on intellectuals and on education. Now, that's not the way that one would ordinarily look if you read all of Gramsci. It was there because it was a student New Left way of reading Gramsci, and it was very powerful for figures in that student New Left. Again, that seems to me that kind of cultural politics has probably worked its way out. And I guess that's why I was trying to understand how one might think about Gramsci for a contemporary politics, which I think does define itself. And here would be, so, okay, I do have one strategy. My own experience over the years with various parts of the American left that come out of the community organizing strain, which is a really very powerful one and goes in all kinds of strange ways, from Alinsky to Cesar Chavez and the farm workers, and by way of the farm workers into Unite Here, into the Yale unions that I've been involved with over the years or whatever, has a very powerful sense of the importance of organizing throughout, and that I must say I have imbibed and feel like I belong to that tradition in many ways. On the other hand, one of the difficulties of that U.S. tradition of organizing, which is there from Alinsky on, is accepting what I think of as a American populist tradition of distinguishing the pragmatic left from the ideological left. And that we're the pragmatic side and you don't really need the ideological side. And some of the people who are on the ideological side essentially share that. And it does seem to me that one of the arguments in Gramsci, and I try to get at this in a way, is that organizing is a process of hegemonizing, in a way, of actually changing moral and cultural conceptions, that it's not simply a technique. It's not simply, I remember many years ago working for Mass Fair Share and being sent out into neighborhoods to knock on doors and raise money so that we could just, on particular, and only stay with local issues. Let's just stay with electrical rates because we don't want to raise anybody's questions about any ideology or whatever. And it does seem to me that in some ways Gramsci's wider sense of the necessity of a kind of cultural reformation, of a philosophical remaking of common sense, is part of the nature of organizing. And that a simply technical version of organizing, which sometimes one sees in the U.S. tradition, could be added to by the American ones. So that, I guess, is kind of the takeaway of the essay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I will. Oh, Peter, you are on stuck. Go ahead, Peter.
Okay. I was really struck, Michael, by that suggestion about Gramsci and Sacco and Vanzetti. And I was thinking that, like, in the article, the Gramsci that's wondering about, is it the intention that there should always be rulers and ruled, and so on. Like, it seems to me that the Gramsci you're drawing out sounds a lot more anarchistish, I suppose, than the Gramsci I'm used to. On one hand, I'm just wondering if you have a sense of, like, his broader relationship to anarchist thought generally, but on the other hand, how far, I don't know, whether you see it that way, whether you see this as a sort of subterraneanly anarchist, or at least a Gramsci whose ultimate horizon is, even more than the withering away of the state, or something like that.
Yeah, I would. Well, that's why I think one of the things that is interesting to think about with Gramsci, and there may be ways that this maybe this to try to tie it to the present, is oddly enough, I feel like I never started think that I would on one side of the kind of syndicalist socialist thing, but by the time over many years, I found myself working more often with unions than with parties. Not that I would argue that anyone else ought to, but it just seemed like there was a kind of syndicalist unconscious in me in one way or another. And the reason, and one of the things I think is interesting is I think that's too often put as a kind of opposition that we might think about more dialectically. And to put it in terms of Gramsci scholarship, it's fairly straightforward that there are two depictions of Gramsci that are out there. One, which was much stronger back in the days of the New Left, which was the real Gramsci, was the Gramsci of the factory councils. The young Gramsci, who was a syndicalist, if not an anarchist, he had his own differences, but nonetheless who felt like the occupation of the factories was really the high point of things, and that really was the moment of a kind of the great Gramsci was the young Gramsci. And then there was the other people who basically said, well, no, by the time of the prison notebooks, it's all about the party. He's realized that the unions and syndicates in that sense are not enough, that factory occupations are not going to be enough, and we really need a communist party, and we should forget all of that. That seems to me a mistaken way of understanding actually Gramsci's own trajectory in that kind of way. And there, the other piece, which is on Gramsci's theory of labor organization, which was the first in this set of 3 ones, has more on that explicit and the difference between, on the one hand, or let's put it this way, the weird connections between his early writings about the factory councils and his later writings about Americanism and Fordism. That he was very interested in the ways in which labor was organized in various kinds of different ones. And it is true that he clearly thought that one of the faults of the factory occupations was that they couldn't get out of the factory. They weren't able to make links to the neighborhood. They weren't able to make links to those workers that were, as he said, not concentrated, servants and waiters in particular. They weren't able to make links to rural workers, and that actually a social movement was going to have to get beyond the factory in that sense. So there is a moment of a kind of self-critique of that early moment. On the other hand, there's, I think, never really a sense that he says, no, we did it all wrong, and that he's not. And so I think there's actually a kind of reflection, and maybe that's another way to say this. The Marxist-anarchist divide has always been seen as a divide about two different attitudes toward the state. It seems to me that what Gramsci is interested in is he doesn't give us a Marxist theory of the state, which would either be identical or different than the anarchist theory of the state. He gives us an entirely different way of thinking about political activity and how states and parties grow out of that at certain historical times, but it gives us a way, I think, in some ways of crossing those lines between the public and the private, between pro-state and anti-state, and then is able to understand in some ways what he calls the practices of the ethical state, or which is to say forms of a kind of welfare state, a state which is educated, a state which is involved in cultural training of people as well, and understanding some of the contradictions of that. So I guess that's kind of the way I would sort of take that, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Michael. Barbara, you are next.
Hi. I wanted to ask something. I'm not sure I'm correct though, but I just wanted to throw it out there. I wonder if the shift from, because I just wonder if in the shift from partisanship to organizing, there isn't somewhat a loss of a sense of class struggle, because I guess, like, orthodoxly, right, if you think of partisanship, the logic is that there is a class which gets represented into a party that defends the material interests of a certain class. And whenever we speak about organizing, the who you organize for with which interests becomes a little bit more vague and dissipated. It's anti-capitalist, but there are many subclasses that typically tend to be represented by many different parties. Not anymore, but back in the day, that would have different ways to go about doing that. And I always interpret this, but I'm not very well educated on the subject. But what I've understood is that this all happens in the context of, Italy having the largest communist party outside of Russia at a point where you go from the Biennio Rosso to Mussolini in the span of 2 years, and this being very disorienting and very confusing for communists who are organizing the working class. And I was reading the book from Mario Tronti today, and he says something that I think is very sort of reminiscent, or like it encapsulates the spirit of the age in Italy, especially in the post-war, but up until the 60s, where he says that the working class today is so mature that it will not accept political adventures on the terrain of material confrontations. That is true, in fact, as in principle, but happily on the terrain of the theoretical struggle, all the conditions seem to be imposing a new spirit of adventurous discovery of the class. So it seems to be like there is this crisis within Western Europe. I think similar thing happens in Germany, but within Italy, this happens very early. That it seems to be that like class struggle on a material basis becomes more and more impossible, and so the shift gradually moves on to a more culturalist approach that has to do. And I wonder if this doesn't feel a little bit like a precursor of, the postmodern shift from class struggle to more like civil liberties, cultural politics of identity and things like this, or if that's too much of a stretch. But to me, Gramsci I always see it as the seed of this broad 20th century movement. Yeah. I wonder if I'm totally wrong.
No, you're not wrong at all, in the sense that I think that the battle over Gramsci's legacy has often been cast in both of those ways. That for some people, Gramsci is the figure of a certain kind of class party that emerges in the middle decades of the 20th century. For other New Left figures, Gramsci was actually the figure for the shift to a kind of cultural politics, which one might see as somehow being further away from class. But I guess I would put it in I want to separate class party and organizing a little bit. And I want to say that the concept of class and the concept of labor is never absent from Gramsci. And I would not want it to be absent from a conception of the left at this point either. Is that the sense that and even here, where he talks about the kinds of organization of people who work for a living and how those kinds of organizations are going to be different, that for him, thinking about organization is not an alternative. Let's put it this way. It's even about how parties should organize themselves. One of the issues that is up for grabs in the 1920s he's writing out of, is the shift from whether or not a party, even a socialist or communist party, should be organized territorially around neighborhoods, or whether it should be organized around workplaces, the kind of turn to factory nuclei, which is that in neither of those cases was one a class version versus a non-class version. They were really different ways of organizing working people, how one would go about doing that. And I think that for Gramsci, the sense, or what I take out of this, is that those questions always have to be asked anew. How are we? And also, in part, out of a dialectic of the politics. One of the reasons why political parties, even by the young organizers like AOC, who defines herself as an organizer, are organized territorially, is because the U.S. parliamentary system is organized territorially. We hold elections according to where you live and where your residence is. It's always seemed to me, it'd be very different to actually have all Walmart employees vote for the Walmart employee person in the House of Representatives. All, I don't know, all higher education employees vote for higher education employee reps in the Senate. But in fact, one of the things I think is so rich about Gramsci is the breaking down of the taken for granted nature of politics, and even the divide between some things are clearly public and therefore political and are legislating, and other things are private and are not elements of legislation. And his sense that the norms of conduct in the household or in the factory, that the organization of labor in Gramsci is not just about Taylorism, but about the norms of conduct, about those informal work rules that are established both by employers and by workers, and in the struggle between them, how long the coffee break is, how offices or whatever, that all of those are norms of conduct that are being struggled over, and that those people, and that would certainly be a kind of class struggle that is invisible in some ways to a party, that those people who are struggling to get a different norm of conduct, that there shouldn't be harassment in this office, are a kind of legislation, that is everyone as a legislator. And so that's where, for me, Gramsci is extremely rich in rethinking the entire way in which we understand how organizations work, but also because he doesn't always use it unlike the sociologists, which always use it in the noun form, not always, but let's say whatever, organization, but as organizing by organizers in organizations, or he won't even use organization that often. Organizers usually work in organisms. And there's a way in which I think the very strong, others may help me, Luca helped me on this, I think the very strong sense in English of the distinction between an organism and an organization, that one is organic and natural and biological, the other is mechanical and bureaucratic, is a difference that is not as strong in Italian, as I understand it. And if you read Gramsci, it's not there, that he goes back and forth between organism and organization. And that's why his organic intellectual is not someone who is rooted in a certain community, but someone who organizes a certain community. So that's, I guess, why, for me, the stress on the larger politics of organizing doesn't necessarily mean that one loses a connection to issues of class or work.
Thank you, Michael. So I don't have a question written out. I'm going, since no one is on stack, I will ask, in the US, I find that there's a lot of resonance from Gramsci's address of the Southern question. It's rather obvious that there's a lot that comes out of the looking at the Southern question. And when we have casual conversations, not just at the MEP, but at other groups around that we've been involved with, like people at Jacobin, some of the anarchists we know who are close to all of this stuff in Brooklyn and such, the question comes up, who's going to go to the countryside and organize in the United States? Do you take out a large, a lot of this gets into almost a cartoony-like thing, because we I think have a wrong, none of us really knows what that countryside is, and it's so varied even within, say, Ohio. The rural Ohio near Toledo is different than rural Ohio near Dayton to a degree. Yet the forces we're up against organize all that. They organize those areas very well, and some of it is just there as stated. It is from a past struggle, so to speak, in the way Gramsci talks about the rising of earlier intellectuals. But I often think of, do I go back to be an effective organizer? Should I go back to the little town I grew up in Michigan, because I will effectively know how to talk to the people there and maybe persuade 2 or 3 people? Now, I bring that up because I have done organizing, and I did organizing with Fred Ross, who you may know of, who was the one who organized the organizing for the Farm Workers Union. And we did go door to door. We did go to factory, field, and communities. And I don't know about Alinsky so much, but Fred Ross's methods were really effective, and we never thought of where we were. If we were in a suburb, the countryside, or in the middle of LA, we did the same kind of thing and won people over. But it was for a very small thing. When I think of the degree of organizing, the type of change we need in the American society, which is pretty much getting globalized, when we look at Italy becoming so Americanized, we know that our way of the social organization here is getting replicated all over the place. But how do we say, yes, organize? We have to organize. What do we do next? Do we organize to get into grad school? Do we organize to, just deal with one of the multiple issues before us? Now, it's a huge question, and I do find that you pointed out very well in this piece, the parties that people went to are of the past. I can't imagine any of the Trotskyist, Maoist, or General Stalinist splits ever emerging to be the party that guides the American working class to some type of transition away from capital to something else. Yet so many of the individuals I know who are in these groups are still in that fantasy that we just haven't found the right party formation yet. So from there, what do we talk about when we think of organizing? What is the point of entry to go from not organizing to organizing is kind of what I'm asking, Michael. And I brought up a few things, but I'll let you go from here.
Yeah. So let me begin with something that I think I do believe, and that might be controversial, is that I do think that in the long run, the era of the mass labor party, which stretched from the German Social Democrats in the late 19th century to the Brazilian Workers' Party in the late 20th century, is more or less over. And that a certain kind of historical set of conditions that made that possible and made those parties very powerful, some of them social democratic, some of them communist, different ones in different places, that it's unlikely to, I think it's unlikely to see that world reemerging. That the USification of parliamentary regimes, the US had always, famously not had a labor party, and that the USification of other political regimes and the turning of professional politics over to advertising agencies and all of that means that that kind of party is not coming back. And that I know is controversial. There are days of the week that I don't believe that, and I think, no, maybe that's not right. And anytime you say it's the end of history, surely something will turn up. But in general, I feel that. And that means that it's much more open to understand what possible kinds of organization there would be. And I guess there I would put a more positive spin on the U.S. case, which is to say it's what a former student of mine, Drew Hannon, who's now up there in Boston area, used to say, the question isn't why is there no socialism in America, but why is there anarchism in America? And I sort of put it that I wouldn't do it exactly like that, but what is interesting is that the U.S., if it never did have one of those giant labor parties, actually had one of the richest traditions of organizing, of community and social movement organizing that one can learn a lot from. It doesn't all agree with itself, and indeed there are as many critics of Alinsky as there are Alinskyites, and that actually is a rich world of political reflection and experience that all of us should pay as much attention to as to the history of those political parties. One of the things that I think one learns, and maybe this is me trying to be less, I grew up in a particularly moralistic moment of the left where numerous of my friends said you must industrialize and wanted to join either Trotskyist or Maoist parties and go off into factories and find the working class in one way or another. I didn't actually think that made that much sense, though to their credit, many of those people have continued to be great organizers and political activists. Many of those people ended up in the revised AFL-CIO decades later. So I guess I end up trying to have a somewhat more, perhaps given my background, Catholic version toward this, perhaps more forgiving. No matter what kind of organizing we do, we're probably sinning in one version or another. I have always thought you organize wherever you are. It is intriguing, and that's why for me it has been in what seemed like not necessarily a cutting edge industry, which is the industry of higher education, but which oddly in some ways is a kind of cutting edge industry. But that idea that there might be a principal contradiction or the most important industry seems to me somewhat mistaken. And then the last thing I'd say, it is intriguing that Gramsci, this kind of goes back to that Southern question. I'll do two thoughts on the Southern question. Gramsci never went back to Sardinia. Gramsci actually starts out as a young Sardinian nationalist. His first kind of political moments is one for Sardinian independence and whatever. And Gramsci, for better or worse, ends up in Turin, organizing there for the most of his career. And even though he ends up seeing the necessity of imagining a national popular, some kind of collective will that would cross that peninsula, it didn't mean for him to go back, even though he was really quite, to see his sense of being subaltern really comes out of that Sardinian experience. One of the anecdotes that comes in one of his early letters is, and one can imagine this from an educational thing, that one of his teachers was a linguist, and of course he was studying linguistics and philology, and he spoke with a strong Sardinian accent and vocabulary, and his teacher would always be asking him for how he says this, was treating him as a kind of native informant from the South. And he actually writes back to his family about this in one way. And so that sense of him as being kind of not part of that Northern Italian world that he is being educated in, I think is a very powerful one right from the beginning. And many people have now said that much of his theory of hegemony and the prestige and legitimacy is based on his way of thinking about the prestige and hegemony of languages. I think that's a very powerful new way of thinking about hegemony in Gramsci scholarship, and I think that is really key there. Yeah, that might be. And where the South is, so for him, the South really is an agricultural South, a rural South. In the U.S., the South is or several Souths. It's not just rural, particularly now, but a South that was both a white and black South, a Protestant South, the South that migrated to the North and Southernized the North in the second half of the 20th century in many ways. So for me, in the end, Gramsci is really the person who gives us not the answers to these, but the questions to ask of how to think about ourselves. Or the imperative to think about that rather than an answer that this is the way to do it one way or another.
Thank you, Michael. Peruse, you're next on Stuck.
Thank you, Michael, for your excellent presentation. My question comes to three different parts of your presentation. One is part two, when you mentioned that you broke it down into national popular awakening, and the second part of it being moral and cultural reformation, and your focus goes on to moral and cultural reformation. Why first not the national popular? And in terms of national popular, I want to say that it's not always from the positive side that Gramsci looks at it. He also looks at it from the negative side, correct? That national popular could be nationalism and social nationalism, and ultimately leading to fascism. One question is that, and the second question I have is, you go on to organic legislators, which I like the fact that you make that addition to it, actually. But on fourth, you go into political fetishism. And on politics, it just, sometimes it comes to my mind as if Gramsci has taken Marx's reproduction scheme and sort of shifted it out of economics into politics. So suddenly we have everything that Marx has said in terms of reproduction schemes in the world of politics. And so if that is so, from the rhythm of thought of the collective to alienation, to reification of social relations, to fetishism as one other aspect. And then I feel that he generalizes that, takes it from the corporations into every social group, all the way. So I'm not sure with your separation of the idea first into state and party and then coming down to the civil society. I don't feel that these movements that you're saying, you're writing them off, that such political parties don't exist, has to do more to do with what's our definition of political, or what is Gramsci's definition of political party, and where is where, as you were just saying, on two levels, one the hegemonic aspect, and the other one on the linguistic aspect. And if I may add a third question in this process, the linguistic part, which seems to be absent from the discussion, goes really into also the arts, literature, theater, film, the language of cinema in terms of playing itself out. So when we are discussing organizational ability, yes, you're right. It's need not be always in the form of a demonstration in the piazza of a given town. But what are the mechanisms for which this is taking effect? And also I see a complete lack of reference to anything outside of the West, meaning everything is reduced again to a discussion over England, Italy, France, or United States. But how do you explain the failure of a left, international left, to ever come and focus on Gramsci properly?
Okay. Oh, those are several different. So let me try a few of them. One is just to say that when I said, I realized when I said it, it came out wrong in a sense. When I said that I focused mainly on the moral and cultural reformation, I just meant me as an individual scholar. I came out of Marxist literary criticism and out of cultural studies. My early work, and still some of it, was about literary and the arts and the theater. And so when I first became interested in Gramsci, that was the side of Gramsci that I was most interested in. And that was the side of Gramsci that I paid the most attention to. And his account of the forms of cultural organization, his account of journalism, of education, of folklore, all of that was really at the heart of the way I saw Gramsci. And all I was saying was that when I taught that course with Luca, in part a division of labor, Luca, as a film scholar, that was his Gramsci as well. And so at that moment I said, okay, Luca, you can teach that part of it, and I'll try to do the state and civil society part of it. And that's why, so I just meant that that was the moment when I really began reading much more carefully the kind of theory of politics, which I think at that time I had basically accepted, well, Perry Anderson said this is what this is happening there, so I guess I'll believe that. Or Peter Thomas said this, and when I actually read that, I ended up feeling like those earlier readings of Gramsci's politics were not as accurate in that sense. And there, I do think, when you say, what is Gramsci's theory of the political party, I would answer, and I think I've got even the quotations in this essay, his theory of the political party is it is one form of a theory of political organization that emerges at a certain point. And indeed, Hegel didn't know the political party. Marx didn't even know the mass political party. For him, the mass political party is a key moment. That will be the modern prince. But for him, the thinking from Machiavelli to Hegel to Marx is a thinking about the changing forms of political organization, each of which may or may not be limited to a particular historical moment. And even when I say, and I may be wrong, that the moment of that mass labor political party is over, that is not to say that it was irrelevant. It has been a major force all around the world. There were all kinds of those parties, but in a number of places, even in Bengal, even in the states of India where communist parties ruled those states for decades, those parties are in crisis at this point. And it does seem very difficult to see that those kinds of parties, whether the Workers' Party in Brazil or the Kerala Communist Party, that those parties in India or the other ones are actually are there. And so it does seem to me that's why for me to return to Gramsci is not to return to a 20th century theory of the political party, but to a much wider theory of how the forms of political organization change, and that we can actually see new forms of political organization that are just emergent by trying to use Gramsci's ideas in that kind of way. On the last thing on the, yes. Two things. On the fetishism Bourdieu has a great line. I had it here. I was going to do this just in case you felt I was too pious about Gramsci. Bourdieu writes at one point, Gramsci is the Ptolemy of the Marxist system, who gave the appearance of a path of rescue from the system while hemming people even more into this blind alley. And so it's plausible, and I know you weren't exactly saying that, but it's plausible that one might see Gramsci as a kind of, and I think that in some sense one of the impatience with Gramsci now is that Gramsci was a reformer within the communist tradition, but as the communist tradition seems to have disappeared, he looks like the Ptolemy of communism in that way, and that he was the illusion of expanding, but actually kept one still within that moment. Now, I think you can see that I don't share that I don't think that he's just taking Marxist fetishism of commodities and translating it, but that I think actually he is taking that kind of insight that Marx had about fetishism and understanding something about way political organizations, it's almost a Feuerbachian sense, something that we created appear to us as things that create us, and seeing that. And I think that's actually a rich kind of way of thinking it. Similarly, I think he's quite straightforward to think that he is doing a critique of political science the way that Marx did a critique of political economy, both inhabiting the categories of political science, but also having a critical stance toward them, and particularly not insisting that those categories are not transhistorical, that there is no transhistorical state that one could find at all places. There's no transhistorical party any more than there's a transhistorical market. And that a theory of a party or a theory of a state which assumed that, I think, would be the last thing I do think is there are the question of Gramsci, and I will, my piece on Gramsci in the United States came out in this nice little collection called Gramsci in the World that Fred Jameson and Roberto Donato edited from Duke, and it has essays actually about Gramsci and the reception of Gramsci in a number of places around the world, and is quite interesting. It remains very uneven. It's clear that Gramsci had important impact on the left in Latin America in a number of cases. Clearly, Gramsci had important impact among the subaltern studies scholars in South Asia, and so I think that, one of the difficulties is that the nature that let's put it this way. Since Gramsci's emphasis on the national popular, and you're right to say there was always a negative element to it because he was thinking about the national popular of fascism, but nonetheless, Gramsci was very aware of what he saw as abstract internationalism, a kind of invocation of an international that didn't see any particularities of region and place. And I think he felt indeed that the Comintern fell into this at various times. And I think for his moment, he wanted to emphasize the specificity of different national paths, different regional paths, even as they fit into an international division of labor. So that he was not only interested in Italians migrating from the south to those northern industrial cities, but the way in which the Italians were becoming a migrant labor population around the world and served a certain function in an international division of labor in those sorts of things. But I think there is, and then I think in the 1950s and 60s, when Gramsci is taken up in Europe, among the communists, it is often against a kind of abstract internationalism. The price of, and I think my original thing, those of us in American studies who took up Gramsci, was not to think about Italy, but to look at the peculiarities of the Americans, the peculiarities of North America and our own Southern question, which was different than the Italian Southern question. The trouble is probably that led us all to be thinking more inside than transnationally. And I think I argue this. I think I argue this more in the Why No U.S., Why No Gramsci in the U.S., is that I think in the moment of globalization, the moment when all of a sudden people started rediscovering not Marxism, but the Marx of capital, because there was a kind of global capitalist system, then Gramsci's attention to national peculiarities and national specificities, I think, got somewhat eclipsed. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is less attention to Gramsci there. It's also there in the peculiarity. This came up a couple of times, and so I'll just throw it out. I do think that the concept of the subaltern, really important concept, and in some sense that would be one way to parse this whole thing. One generation saw Gramsci as the theorist of the party, the modern prince. That indeed was the way the first collection of Gramsci in English was called The Modern Prince. Another generation, we have that where, I was going to bring that, I have it here. Yes, the newest translation of the actual one, of all, for the first time, we now have all of the notes on subaltern social groups translated into English. That is the last part of Joe Buttigieg's work that Marcus Green has put together, a really interesting, that just came out this summer. I haven't actually fully digested it, whatever. But it does seem to me that actually, I tend to think that many of the people who've written on the subaltern have missed the fact that the subaltern is the other side of what Gramsci calls the collective worker. And that there's a kind of dialectic in Gramsci's work of the collective worker and the subaltern. And that in some ways those are both his names for ordinary working people in two different moments. For him, the collective worker is the possibility of a self-organization of labor. Again, one might call it a party, but I think he thinks of it as the self-organization of labor, hegemony born in the factory. On the other hand, his strong sense that that in order for that to happen, certain habits of subalternity, certain habits of deference, certain habits have to be overcome. That a kind of cultural revolution, a kind of consciousness raising is necessary for the emergence of the subaltern into the collective worker. And that's how he sees himself. One of the distinctions, there's several socialist thinkers of the 20s who he argues a lot with. Oddly, he doesn't argue much with Lenin. Lenin's example is really important to him. I'm not sure Lenin's writings were ever that important. Bukharin's writings are really the most important in terms of the Soviet thinkers. And of course, partly because he was a teacher. Remember, he taught young militants in the Communist Party school. And he was using Bukharin's handbook to teach. And as a result, he became somewhat impatient with Bukharin's handbook as not the best way to teach. And so one of the ways Gramsci is writing the prison notebooks is, how do we explain, not to those people that we're trying to persuade, but even to the young militants who have joined us, what this new conception of the world is? And there's very much, and one of the people who he critiques and is all through the prison notebooks is Henri de Man, who is a very interesting Belgian socialist of the 1920s, who basically argues that ordinary working class culture objects to Marxism. And de Man takes the position of working class culture against modern science, seen as Marxism, and develops a very powerful critique of Marxism on a kind of labor movement critique of Marxism. One might think of it as a kind of Belgian equivalent of Samuel Gompers or something like that in the United States, in a way. And Gramsci is both. He feels like you have to respond to this. And for him, de Man's, the book I think was called The Psychology of Socialism, he was reading, I think, an Italian translation of it. And Gramsci writes several times that, no, the problem with de Man is de Man takes a folklorist approach to working class culture. He's worried that the modern world is going to destroy it and it has to be defended regardless of its consciousness. And Gramsci says, no, we have to pay attention to actual working class culture as we encounter it as organizers, but we have to reorganize it. We have to be educators and organizers and renovators, and we actually have to change those conceptions of the world. We can't just give in to those conceptions of the world because they exist. And I think his debate with de Man, and in some ways I think there is actually a quite important one in the prison notebooks that I think is often, de Man, unfortunately, taking that position ends up much closer to kind of fascism by the late 1930s and 40s, and so as a result has dropped out of the socialist tradition. But in the 1920s, that was one of the major European books in socialist theory. And Gramsci realizes that and feels like he has to engage with that. At that time, de Man is much more of a figure to be reckoned with than Gramsci himself. I mean, in terms of what people would have known. That book was translated in 5 or 6 languages in the 1920s.
Thank you, Michael. Peruse is back on stack. No one else is there yet, so Peruse. You need to unmute.
2 questions based on a range of richness of the response that you gave. One, you mentioned the relationship of Gramsci to Machiavelli, but you really didn't fully elaborate on that. If I may ask a question in that framework, particularly as it relates to who is the legislator and how do you legislate? If as an organizer we follow what Machiavelli is saying and what Gramsci is, I think, abides by what Machiavelli is saying, then how do you fit his theory of strategy and tactic with this duality of the fact that Machiavelli says that you cannot tell the truth? And in a game of chess, I really would like to know that, the other side never tells us what we are supposed to know. They are in the know and we are not. But we are supposed to know everybody what we think, in terms of exposing them or go on the margin and decide whether we can frontally attack them or take a step back and strategically approach it. So within that framework of strategy and tactic and Gramsci's dual perspective, how would you position it in terms of organizing and being a legislator?
Yeah, can I duck that one and actually ask if anyone else has it? I must say one reason I have so little on the Mach. I thought the 2 points. The one point I make about Machiavelli that was important for that essay was Gramsci's own sense that Machiavelli should not be seen as a theorist of politics for all time, but a theorist of his own time, and that one might actually approach Gramsci in the way that Gramsci approached Machiavelli. On the other hand, at the time I wrote that essay, I knew virtually nothing about Machiavelli. Because Gramsci is one of those figures that brings you into his world, I have since recently read the new biography of Machiavelli, which is quite fascinating, and have been reading some of Machiavelli's own work. But I must say, I do not feel like I have any position about Machiavelli or Gramsci's reading of Machiavelli. Machiavelli has never, I think, had much role in U.S. political culture or thought in the same ways, and so I'm actually, if other people have more, I'd rather hear what you have to say about how Gramsci picks up Machiavelli than you listening to me on it, because I really probably don't have much to offer.
One more question, if I may.
Yeah.
You also mentioned organic intellectuals as part 3 of your presentation. Organic legislators. Why aren't you appending 2 other words, traditional legislators or cosmopolitan legislators?
Yes, I would have no problem with doing that. It's intriguing to me. I guess it depends how far one wants to stretch this, and I do feel like that. I do think that this essay offers something that people who have worked on Gramsci have not noticed or whatever. And I make in a footnote a kind of interesting argument that the new scholars of Gramsci have argued, which are that the notebooks which were used to be referred to as miscellaneous notebooks and were then taken to be secondary. There are notebooks that have names, and those notes on Machiavelli or whatever, and those are central, and the miscellaneous ones were kind of just like miscellaneous. And there's a very interesting and I think persuasive philological argument that the miscellaneous notebooks were places where Gramsci was not just recopying and sharpening his earlier thoughts, but was developing new thoughts that weren't there. And that's why in the earlier parts of it, and that he was even, in a sense, running out of time and space to come up with these. And so that's why I think actually Gramsci develops the idea that everyone is an intellectual, of organic and traditional intellectuals and cosmopolitan intellectuals, his writing on in the earlier stages. And one of his real early things is that I'm going to have a little book on intellectuals. That might be one of the things I do when I'm in prison. And I think he actually only, as now that we know something of the dating of the prison notebooks, it's only later that he begins to use the phrase everyone is a legislator, and he begins to see the sense of being a legislator as a kind of analog of what he's already developed as it. And it's still, there's only a half a dozen notes that are about legislators in this way. And so I could be criticized for exaggerating this. I think not. I think this is actually, you can see in these half dozen notes, him moving in a different direction that is analogous to other things that he's done and are very powerful. That's why he never gets to actually naming them organic intellectuals or traditional organic legislators or traditional legislators. However, when he does say, I think there's one of the phrases when he means when he says a legislator of the political state version, he means essentially a traditional legislator, someone who would be recognized as a legislator in that way.
So Mark said that he could answer part of that question. So Mark, you do, and then after Mark, we have Fiona who has a question. So Mark, go ahead, and then we'll see if Michael responds to what you say, Mark, and then Fiona, your question after. Go ahead.
So Machiavelli, hang on, I'm getting an echo for myself. All right, I hope you can you still hear me?
Yes, you are. We can hear you.
Machiavelli distinguished, Philippe Schmitter and I did a book on a kind of primer, a kind of prolegomenon to political science, actually. And we talked about Machiavelli quite a bit in there. And Machiavelli distinguished between what one might call normal politics, what we call type 1 politics, which takes place within established rules, norms, and practices and institutions, and the kind of world that Gramsci wants to focus on and interrogate, and not take for granted. And then type 2 politics, which is abnormal times when, according to Machiavelli, the dams and dikes, as Machiavelli called them, have broken down, and politics shifts to the task of creating new rules, norms, practices, and institutions. And so for Machiavelli, the lying, if you like, what you were asking about, Peruz, the kind of no holds barred, gloves off sort of rough and tumble politics takes place at those moments when it's time to, type 2 politics, to create new forms of institutions, which is, of course, what Gramsci and anyone on the left is all about. But Gramsci is also about figuring out how type 1 politics operates which is what we take for granted as common sense. So that's just a distinction that some people may find helpful on Machiavelli.
Fiona, do you have your question?
Hey, thanks. This is so interesting. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate your work in general. I haven't read this piece though, so pardon if I'm making some obvious comment, but I definitely don't have anything to say about Machiavelli, but that's also interesting. One of the things that struck me about what your comment, or two things. One, Barbara brought up Tronti's book, and one of the things I was curious about was the critique of Gramsci by the autonomists in the 70s, and why they had such a strong anti-Gramscian position. I've never quite understood that. If from you, or if you're familiar with that critique, and if you think that was part of this misreading, or if it was or if it was because he was so associated with the party or what have you. But it just didn't seem like even this question that you're raising about the territory versus the factory is exactly the kinds of conversations that the autonomists, or debates that the autonomists were having, so that they were trying to do both, right? So I just find it really interesting, and I'd be curious, because I've never sort of been able to figure that out. The second thing that I thought was really interesting is that you raised this question of the kind of geographical language and of the Southern question, and that you're kind of translating that to the U.S. context. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on this idea of the Southern question as a framework for political analysis, or political geography, or geographic imagination, that I've never thought about it as a concept that could translate in that way. And I'm thinking about now that you said that, and I'm like, I'm beaming in from Montreal, and that in Canada the Southern and Northern question has its own like complex and kind of inverse sort of dynamic or political economic context. So yes, those are my questions. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, I think I can't really answer either, but I can address both. I think that with the autonomous resistance to Gramsci, I think one of the weird things is that for them, Gramsci had become a national treasure already. And so that what was seen as an oppositional force in other places, in Britain, here, or whatever, seemed so much part of a kind of established left, was owned and operated by the Italian Communist Party. And so I think they just found they had to, and also a kind of anxiety of influence to get out from under. The thing that made me understand it more than anything else, and I have not read it recently, but there's a little piece that Antonio Negri wrote that I think is called Gramsci and Us, which is a later piece. It's not his early kind of critique, where he sort of reflects on why it was they felt that they had to reject Gramsci. And it's him sort of making his peace with Gramsci later on. At least that's the way I remember it. But I remember that being the one essay that made me understand it more than the other. And I guess I have a similar kind of answer to the second half on the Southern question. I can't say that personally I have found that the richest or most exciting part of Gramsci. That was the essay on the Southern question, was sort of one of the last essays he wrote before going to prison. I guess I do find with lots of Gramsci that I do find the speculation and the openness of the prison notebook essays and ideas richer than the published pieces that he wrote in the earlier 1920s, including the famous one on the Southern question. There's a way in which, and I think that you can even see now the moment in, I forget exactly what it is. I've had it written down somewhere. The summer of 1930, or I think it's the summer of 1930, which if you read them chronologically using the Buttigieg, you see someone who is actually just putting a whole bunch of different notes together. And also there's one summer where it all comes together, where in my mind Gramsci becomes Gramsci, where side by side the first ideas on the subaltern, the first on Americanism and Fordism, the first on Marxism are all not separated in different parts, but are all there. And he begins not just making notes on his reading, but actually writing small essays that are the beginning of that. And so for me, there is a kind of moment, though I started by saying I didn't want to fetishize the early and late Gramsci. There is a moment where the Gramsci that I respond to really emerges at that moment. That said, I would say there's two people who've written really well on this, and I think one, Tim Brennan, who has really taken up Gramsci on the Southern question and tried to think that through for post-colonial studies in general, and Roberto Dainato, who is the co-editor of this Gramsci in the World, both, and has really thought very much about kind of how Italy is, how Europe is imagined with a North and a South, and the issue of the South of Europe, not just the South of Italy, the kind of rereading of Gramsci as a Mediterranean thinker in the context of the crisis of migration across the Mediterranean. Ian Chambers did some of that work in his writing, and so there are a number of people who have rethought Gramsci's Southern question as a kind of Mediterranean question, as a question of North Africa and Southern Europe that is really rich. And so, though I don't feel like I've contributed to that, I would suggest at least Tim's work, Roberto Dainato's, and Ian Chambers and Lydia Curdy's work on thinking about that. And actually, my colleague Luca Peretti, when we were co-teaching the course, he did a whole week on Gramsci as a Mediterranean thinker. And a set of readings together, and Luca's work really, and I think he was coming out of a contemporary, I mean a 2018 or whatever year we taught that was, Italian thinking about Gramsci, even a post-autonomia, where all of a sudden Gramsci was being reread as Italians were rethinking their own situation in the context of the crisis of migration and of closing the borders in the Mediterranean. And so that's another way, I think, of seeing Gramsci very powerfully, that takes it out of that older nation-state way of thinking about, in which Gramsci as a European thinker is actually Gramsci as a theorist of migration in contemporary Europe.
So there's not anyone on stack but Michael. So I liked your response before on organizing, and we have as part of your essay, leaders led, rulers ruled. And if everyone is to become a legislator, there gets to be a period of time where those who have, say, more advanced skills end up we imagine that we are combining our leadership and those that we are leading with our leadership into an egalitarian future, I think. I mean, that when I think along the principles by which we keep pouring ourselves into our research, doing what we do with what we're doing, that we are imagining a real kind of communism of the future. Yet in our organizing and becoming something as a force to be reckoned with what we are trying to change, there gets to be a bureaucratization of a kind. And how in this everybody a legislator world, I assume Gramsci has sections where he speaks on preventing that ossification, so to speak. And then it is where you lose everyone wanting to be a legislator. We see the level of mainstream political participation go through ebbs and flows of this or that, where in general, large parts of working classes resign from political engagement in those terms. At the same time, this fight we have ahead of us is really challenging, and we are organizing, and we will meet some defeats. And I'm just, and then a big defeat can be lack of enthusiasm. That second part of Gramsci's L'Ordine Nuovo quote of rouse yourselves, we need the enthusiasm. Where do you keep this enthusiasm going except for with like sloganeering or something like that, which we know doesn't work? And I'm just throwing that out there, taking an aspect of everybody being a legislator.
Oh, yeah. Oh, actually, yes. Now, that solved it for me. So, one thing is that it's intriguing that when I first was going into this stuff, I was resistant to his leaders and led, ruled and rules, and his bracketing of the question that, well, we won't ask right now how this came to be. He does then say immediately, we don't think this is necessary. It is not in nature that there are rules and led, just as Marx says in Capital, it's not in nature that there are those who own the means of production and those who own. But we're going to bracket that in order to understand the situation we have in some kinds of ways. And I think it's fair to say that Gramsci was not a utopian thinker. Gramsci he actually is kind of interested in utopias as a genre, but more as a way to understand popular thought than as a kind of model. And I think that in the context that he was working, he clearly thought that the political organizations that he was part of and the party had to have leaders, and indeed needed to train leaders. One of the crucial things is that he felt that it's something he actually shares with Trotsky's Great Problems of Everyday Life from the mid-20s also, which is that the young militants in their parties are not actually educated well enough to lead the parties, and that actually they need to raise the cultural level of their own activists in some kinds of ways. And so in order to create them as better leaders, in order to have them as more democratic leaders, but without, I think, at this moment, dropping that. And I think however, there's one real reason that I think he sees this, and I'll say this. One is, throughout the prison notebooks, there's a very powerful sense of the distortion of humanity that the division between mental and manual labor has created. And he will insist all the way through that every form of manual labor requires mental labor. There's no such thing, he says, as the trained guerrillas that Taylor thought, that every form of manual labor, it has a mental aspect. He will also say every form of mental labor has a manual aspect. He has a whole remarkable thing that if you realized his own disabled body and how hard it was for him, where he says a scholar could only read for 16 hours a day if they had been physically trained to this all through their childhood. And he's talking about himself in that kind of way, that there's a kind of physical labor that is involved to do the work of reading and writing the prison notebooks. And he sees both of those as having kind of, and his sense, there's very little, he's very skeptical of romantic craft visions of labor. This is not William Morris. He thinks that actually the imposition of new organizations of labor is a remaking of our bodies, a remaking of our sexuality in the Americanism and Fordism, a remaking that actually has to be forced on people in many ways, that the creation of a new society has historically always been a kind of remaking of people. On the other hand, I think he does think, and this may be where there's a kind of hopefulness, and what I meant by that collective worker is that he feels that actually in working together, people come up with, he has this great essay, once again on the organic capacities of the working class, come up with new organic capacities that come out of working together. It's one of the reasons he says the factory occupations were so important. Because he says a strike is important, but a strike only asks of people patience, persistence, and loyalty. We're going on strike, stand in the picket line, turn up there. The factory occupations ask people, reorganize the whole workplace, continue to produce, continue to work, but don't have a boss. Figure it out yourself. And he said, and he has this amazing moment where he says, even the Sunday theatrical, old workers who had been borne down by years of labor, you thought they had no imagination, on the Sunday theatricals at the factory occupation were putting on our theater pieces. And there was a kind of imagination that one did not expect. And so I think there is in Gramsci a kind of belief that in the organic capacities of the organization of work between people. That's one of the reasons why, for me, there isn't a gap, the point that was made earlier, between class and organization. Because for him, the emergence of a working class comes out of a certain kind of being organized to work in some way, and then self-organizing oneself in response to that. So it's not quite a utopian democracy. That's why he probably is not the mutual aid of the anarchists. My late great friend David Graeber, who I am reading now, on the dawn of everything, and the kind of is a much more, I think, optimistic sense of the kinds of political imagination that social groups have had. Gramsci, I think, was working out of a situation where it was hard for him to see that liberatory moment, and particularly under fascism, just trying to figure out how one could organize against this rather than imagining one could see an entirely different society.
So we have Peruz on stack, but as my capacity, even diminished as it is as I age as an organizer, I want to make sure that people with questions, and I know everyone here has questions. Peruz, this would be your third question. I'm not saying it's not important, but I want to make sure there are no people with a question that is not being asked, because all questions are really there to be, if anyone is thinking of, okay. Peruz, go ahead and ask your question.
Just a short comment first to Mark Blecher's commentary. The question of Machiavelli pertained to deception, not the type 1, type 2 organization, but I'm thankful for your response on that. But coming back to Michael, again, on the syndicalist movement, I feel like there is always a positive note attached, but there is also a negative note that Gramsci attaches to it. I think also that it is quite possible for the syndicalists, insofar that they have only corporate interests and they have not gone through that catharsis moment, then it can be sabotaged by the, and I don't want to reduce it to a sabotage that's like a conspiracy, but really dominated by the fascist party or organs of it. But to your other commentary about leaders and led, and again we come back to this issue of like hegemon, which means leadership. And if you have leadership, you have followership. So we are back into the world of hegemony. And when we come to Gramsci, I feel that Gramsci takes politics to everything, and really, including all the arts, becomes politics. So the organizing aspect, or who is the legislator, if you consider for a moment, I always come back to the example of jazz and blues and the spirituals and the soul of this country, that is hegemonic power of a subaltern group, and I would not reduce subaltern groups only to working class. You know, any group, it could be again positive or negative, including religious segments as subaltern groups, because they are alternatives and they prove to be alternatives in other parts of the world. So just to be brief, the world of language is the world of organization, and the world of politics includes arts, and all of that. The language of politics, the language of how we of what we communicate, is outside. I don't want to say it's outside. Only a portion of it includes production of commodities, as the left usually analyzes it. And with Gramsci, we have Marx exploding into all different forms of social groupings and leadership and followerships in every organisms that is a living organism. Thank you. I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment.
Yeah, well, let me say that on one hand, I agree completely with everything you just said. But then let me just, for the sake of discussion, make a friendly amendment to it, which is, I guess, one thing precisely because in the spirit of what you've said, I would say one of the reasons why there are two projects in Gramsci is because he doesn't actually want to reduce all thought and art to politics in a narrower sense. And I think that's why it's necessary to have both everyone as a legislator and everyone as an intellectual. And even if the poets and the jazz musicians are in some sense legislators of the humanity, you know, as Shelley said, in another sense, I think he does want to he never wants, and he's aware of this because of his own political tradition, he doesn't want to instrumentalize the arts or thought. And his critique of the proletarian novel and his critique of various forms of narrowly political art that actually, and there I think the double sense in him of both norms of conduct, which is one kind of activity, and conceptions of the world, which is a different kind of activity. And I think there is a way, for me, in Gramsci, that he allows us not to too quickly reduce all of the arts to the political. That, you know, that in some sense there's moments where he's interested in doing readings of Dante for the sake of readings of Dante. And not necessarily for a specific political purpose. And that, though in the larger sense, and that's where I would agree with you, his sense is that indeed the transformation of our entire conceptions of the world over a historic period is a political transformation. That the philosophy of praxis is for him like the Reformation. It is going to be a complete transformation of people's ways of living, their modes of interacting, their artworks, their sculptures, their buildings. I think he has that sense of a kind of large cultural revolution. So that's I think, a friendly amendment, because and I think, and I would agree also, if I'm on the syndicalism one, it is clear, you're exactly right there, to the point that he sees another danger in his own movement of what he sees as, and Lenin and the others of that generation saw as economism, the reduction of political motives to economic interests, as he says at one point, theoretical syndicalism. That's a kind of reading of politics down to a simple kind of interest thing. And he is skeptical throughout of reading, of this sort of where's the money kind of analysis in his account of the Boulanger social movement, a social movement of the right. He says we should not first, by looking at this, is say who benefits this, who's the money that are behind this thing. We have to understand what are the conceptions of the world that are winning consent. Why is this social movement of the right winning consent of people, and take those seriously? Then at the end, he says, we might ask who are the people behind it who are financing it and making money on it. But we can't start there. And I think that's a really, again, particularly since American populist radicalism that I feel I was trained in and we all imbibe almost naturally in the U.S., is often back to the Beardian accounts of the Constitution, drawn to a kind of economic interest as the basis of politics, that actually the U.S. left really needs to listen to Gramsci on that, because we have all too much a tendency, including myself, to say, oh no, these are the big pharma companies and they want to have their money. No, it's much more, even I won't go into that, but you know what I mean.
Peter, your question or comment, and that will be our last one for today. And then, Michael, with your response to Peter, you can incorporate your closing statement at the same time, and it'll be around 4 o'clock. Go ahead, Peter.
Well, this is probably nothing, so hopefully you'll have plenty of time for the closing. I was just thinking your comment on the sort of Graeber sharing some kind of Gramscian impulses, but in a more optimistic key. I was thinking the idea that everyone is a legislator insofar as they pass on norms of conduct to one another, and that kind of diffusion of social power and its kind of proliferation through norms just feels like if you say that in a much more pessimistic key, that's kind of precisely Foucault in a lot of ways. And I guess that between those, well, A, whether you buy that, B, whether this is the Gramsci you're presenting is kind of presenting a sort of middle ground between those, or what is that sort of relationship? That makes sense.
Well, yeah, actually, so maybe it is a place to end. I do think that it's worth always trying to take those moments where Gramsci doesn't seem to fit ways in which we see things necessarily, or that one often, almost every Gramsci scholar creates a Gramsci that they kind of are in their own image or whatever, and one might challenge this or there. Two things that I think are there. I am struck by the parallels between some of Foucault's talking about conduct in the governmentality lectures and Gramsci's interest in the norms of conduct, in I had at the end of this essay, his use of the metaphor of the conductor of an orchestra to think about leadership and the varieties of leadership. It's actually 3 different models. It's not like a single model. And I think that the metaphor of conduct and of conductors, and both as a conductor, as someone who runs the orchestra, but also in that version that by actually conducting oneself appropriately, one is reinforcing norms of conduct. And I think that that's a kind of other way of thinking about hegemony as in that way. Another word that has always struck me, teaching it to undergraduates over the years, the most intriguing thing I find is that Gramsci takes the word conformism as a positive term conforming with, literally conforming, and that conforming with is that's an act of leadership. It's actually an act of the conceptions of whatever and it's the act of hegemony. If a political organization conforms a society, that's actually a positive thing. And particularly in a culture where being a nonconformist or thinking that conformity is a bad thing, I've always found students have had a hard time. How can you be arguing for conformism? That seems to be what we're opposed to. And I guess that's the element where Gramsci isn't exactly an anarchist, at least in the American sense of an anarchist. That kind of really resistance to conformism. One, it's very interesting to read Gramsci next to a figure who's 20 years older, not exactly that same generation, Emma Goldman, who's also an immigrant to the U.S. And Goldman is much more opposed to conformism of any sort in lots of ways, and who doesn't want any kinds of laws, and in many ways one of the powerful anarchist theorists of that generation or whatever. And one can see a very different sense of power, of states, of governments in her own opposition to that. To put Goldman and Gramsci together, as I've done several times in teaching, is quite fascinating. And I have found over the years that students more immediately respond to Goldman's Emersonian antinomianism, and she loves Emerson and Thoreau. In a way, Gramsci is not an Emersonian thinker or a Thoreauvian thinker in that way. And I think that's actually one of the useful challenges of Gramsci to figures that have grown up in the U.S. left.
Michael, I would say that's a new lecture because it would be fascinating and would bring up as many questions as today has. And I know that an hour from now, questions are going to pop into people's heads that they would have liked to have asked, but you did 2 hours. It's been a great presentation. Thank you so much. And I thank this group of people that came and have stuck through and listened and taken this in. And I really appreciate what you did and taking your time to carefully prepare for today. Even though you wrote the essay, you came in like it was fresh, and I very appreciate that. So, Michael, thanks much. We hope to have a visit in the spring or early summer again with the working group. I don't mean to put you on the spot publicly like this, but it's always a highlight of our schedule, and we'd love to do that again. And thank you, everyone. Tomorrow again is Max Haven on revenge capitalism. It would be interesting to compare what Max has to say with some of what we discussed today. His is kind of veering in that autonomous anarchist wing of Marxism, and I find this will be an interesting weekend for those who can come to both talks. Again, Michael, bravo. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Ciao.
you.